Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. I hope you've had a good summer full of fun, travel, family, and friends. And I'm Jim Van Epps, president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and host for this evening's presentation by retired Ambassador Doug Silliman, who serves as the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. But to begin, for our sponsors tonight, I'd like to highlight Kreitz Auto Group, which has been striving to provide the highest level of automotive excellence in Savannah and the Coastal Empire for about 80 years. We're grateful to Kreitz for continuing as a platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for 2021 and 2022. And then also we're grateful to Planters Inn, a continuing sponsor. There are other hotels in Savannah, but there isn't another boutique hotel that offers the extravagant, as you can read on there, extravagant amenities, elegantly appointed rooms, and historic location that you'll find at Planters Inn. So thank you, Planters Inn. To begin, we are fortunate this evening to have two students from Savannah State who have taken advantage of the Savannah Council's scholarships, which we provide for college students traveling overseas. And I'd like to introduce them, but first I'm going to introduce Melanie Smith, who works with them from Savannah State, and she will introduce the two students who are going to briefly talk about their experiences this past summer. Melanie?
I'm also a part-time instructor, so I don't actually think I need the microphone. Good evening. My name is Melanie Smith. I'm with Savannah State University, as I was precluded with. I have two of my students who were so honored to be a part of your generous donation for the scholarships that they were able to take part in, Miss Sydney Wolf and Alana Howard, and I will let them kind of tell their own little stories. I promise that they won't take up too much time, but so I'll better shush so that they can go. All right, ladies, you're on.
안녕하세요. 제 이름은 시드니입니다. 한양 대학교 학생이에요. Hi, my name is Sydney. I went to South Korea thanks to your generous donation, and I attended Hanyang University in the spring of 22. These are some photos from my trip. This is called jimdok. This is marinated chicken with vegetables, mushrooms, cheese, tteokbokki, which are rice cakes, and smothered in cheese. This, I took a Korean class. Those are all of my classmates and my Korean teacher. This is during cherry blossom season. That is a cherry blossom tree, and that is the Lottie World Tower, which is the 5th tallest tower in the world. This was the entrance to one of the palaces in Korea. They're very historical sites that kings and queens and such would live in. This was me in hanbok, which is a very Korean traditional clothing that men and women used to wear. And that is all I have to say. Thank you for your generous donation. 감사합니다.
Hola, me llamo Alana. This summer I was able to go to Costa Rica with 4 other students, all because of you guys, so I just want to thank you for that. This right here is a photo of me inside of a theater in San Jose. This is a photo of, that's another one of the students who was there, and this is her host family and friends. We did a lot of clubbing, but studying, you know, learning Spanish, but we have fun. This is a traditional Costa Rican meal, cansado. It usually comes with a protein, like meat, chicken, steak. It comes with the beans, the rice, the little salad on the side, and the plantains. This is a meal that my Tica mother made, my Costa Rican mother made for me. You can see her little feet back there. But that's some empanadas. I had fresh fruit every morning, hot tea whenever I asked her. And this is a photo of me in front of the Gracia sign. Gracia, Costa Rica is where I went. So that was in the central of the small city that we was in, and that was a big cathedral church in the back. So Again, thank you so much for the experience, and it's something I'll never forget.
I got it. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, young ladies. And we hope you enjoyed the terrific experiences you had, and we were pleased to be able to support your studies abroad. Also, I would like to recognize this evening that Kevin Goldberg is here with several students from Savannah Country Day. Look at them nodding their heads. Can you all raise your hand? I mean, we can pick out who you are, but there you go. Welcome. And the experiences that the two students from Savannah Country Day had, we hope it encourages you to support the Savannah Council Scholarship Program. And you can do that, which will assist us in providing additional travel experiences in the coming years for other students in the Savannah area. If you want to help change the world one person at a time, our scholarship program helps provide travel opportunities to young students who can do that. And you see the potential that's here. Now, our speaker this evening is Ambassador Silliman, is currently president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. You've been provided his bio, but a couple points to highlight. He previously served as United States Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019, and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait before that. Prior to that, he served as Senior Advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. Department of State and as Deputy Chief of Mission in our embassies in Iraq and Ankara, Turkey. He's also served in positions in or relating to Jordan, Lebanon, Pakistan, Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and Tunis, Tunisia. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2019. He received the Presidential Distinguished Service Award from President Trump and has several other awards, as you can imagine, with that distinguished career. He speaks French and Arabic and others I understand, but he only highlighted those in his bio. And some would say, most importantly, he's married and has 2 adult children. Very impressive. We're privileged to have him as our speaker this evening. Now, to his topic. The United States, Joe Biden, and the changing landscape of the Middle East. When President Biden took office, his foreign policy prioritized reestablishing America's traditional alliances in Europe and Asia, dealing with the challenge of a rising Russia and watching an the challenge of a rising China and watching an unpredictable Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine created global price spikes in food and energy and strained U.S. relations with traditional partners in the Middle East. What did President Biden accomplish on his trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia? And what more needs to be done? We shall hear very quickly. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Doug Silliman to the podium. There you go. It's about time I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. I want to first call out to the Savannah Council on World Affairs for the work that you're doing with scholarships, because as some of you who had dinner with me tonight realize, I might not have joined the Foreign Service, I might not have had the career that I had unless a high school teacher suggested this career to me, and that if she and her husband hadn't pitched in to send me on a tour of Europe as a senior graduation present to show me the world. What you are doing for these young people is amazing, and I really applaud you as a group for it. And those of you who are here and beneficiaries of this generosity, it is a gift that will help you and give back to you for the rest of your lives. You may not realize it yet, but what you have learned in studying other parts of the world will help you not only understand the world, but what happens here in the United States as well. So thank you all for doing that. Otherwise, I'll say good evening. Thank you very much. This is my first time in Savannah. I have been all around the region. I've got a sister-in-law in Aiken and friends in Hilton Head and elsewhere nearby, but I'm honored to be here tonight. I had a lovely meal of fried green tomatoes and shrimp and grits because I was back in the South. So I'm feeling quite full at the moment. But I think that's powered me to give you an introduction to a very interesting topic. I want to thank Jim Van Epps, the president, for inviting me, and my friend and colleague, Ambassador Larry Silverman, a member of the World Affairs Council of Savannah, for inviting me as well. I want to talk a little bit about, as you heard, America, Joe Biden, and the changing landscape of the Middle East. And I want to start there with the changing landscape, because things aren't the way that they've always been in the Middle East. And there are three big trends that I want to highlight and have you take into account as you're looking at news of events that happen in the Middle East or commentary in U.S. politics. And those are the growing multipolarity of the world, the rise of newly strong global and regional powers compared to the United States, declining confidence of Middle Eastern governments in the commitment of the United States to their defense and their well-being, as well as a declining U.S. desire to be engaged in the Middle East. And third, the politicization of U.S. foreign policy in U.S. politics, which makes it more difficult to rationalize American policies. So let me take these three trends one at a time. First, I want to go to multipolarity. Some academics call this polycentricity, but all it means is that when I was born into a bipolar world. It was the United States and the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world became unipolar. We were the only big guy on all the blocks around the world, and everybody looked to the United States for guidance, for investment, and everybody criticized the United States when they didn't like what we did. What we are seeing now, with the rise of a more economically powerful China, with the really unpredictable behavior of Russia, especially in the invasion of Ukraine, but also in the rise of some middle-sized countries like Turkey, Brazil, India, and Saudi Arabia, and even some of America's best friends in the Middle East, Israel and the United Arab Emirates. You see countries who are beginning to feel agency, and they're beginning to make their own policies without reference to the United States or many other countries, kind of the way the United States has done for generations. They say, we're going to do what we think is best for us and then deal with the consequences later. This is a real trend, and if anybody tells you on the news that the United States can dictate policies to most countries in the world, it is no longer true. That was true when I was a junior officer in the Foreign Service 25, 30 years ago. It is decreasingly true. And I think we are going to find ourselves over the course of the next 20 to 30 years as one of many powerful countries in the world. Now, I will explain all this by saying that doesn't mean the United States is getting any weaker. We are still the largest economy, the most innovative economy, the strongest military, the most influential soft power and cultural power in the world. The difference is that there are now a lot more countries that have developed economically, that have developed militarily, and have gained the confidence to not always look to a pole, a sponsor, the United States or the Soviet Union, to take guidance for their policies. This is something, particularly in the Middle East, that we have to take into account. It isn't all bad. For example, as part of this process of countries pursuing their own interests separately from the United States, we have seen the United Arab Emirates begin talks with Iran, and the UAE has sent its ambassador back to Tehran after 7 years because they want to reduce tensions. Saudi Arabia is also in talks with Tehran because they do not want to have more Iranian attacks on Saudi oil fields. The big conflict in the Gulf between Gulf countries, especially Qatar, has essentially been ended. And there is a serious effort from Saudi Arabia and the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council to end the war in Yemen and also to bring Iran into a solution. So these are all good results of countries acting in what they see as their own best interests. It isn't always what the United States and the US government would have them do. So, and again, as I said, we have to realize that the United States can no longer dictate to a lot of our traditional friends what they would do to support US interests. They're going to be focusing on their own interests. Second topic is the decline of Middle Eastern countries in confidence in America's commitment to their defense and their well-being. The basis of the US commitment to the Middle East, especially as the British Empire withdrew from South Asia at the end of World War II was the beginning of relations with Israel, and also the establishment of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain in the Persian Gulf to help protect shipping lanes and trade in the Persian Gulf. Ties strengthened more in the 1980s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and after the Iranian Revolution, and was guided for 3 decades by 2 concepts. One called the Carter Doctrine, which Jimmy Carter put in place in 1980, which was designed to keep countries not from the region out of the region. And it was specifically trying to push the Soviet Union to keep them in Afghanistan and not let them come closer to the Middle East. President Reagan added to that later that same year, actually in 1981, and said we want to have countries in the region protect stability. This was aimed at the results of the Iranian Revolution and Iranian misbehavior in the Gulf in the region. So some of the things that we did for our Gulf friends, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman, in the 1980s included reflagging Kuwaiti tankers which had been harassed by the Iranian Navy as American ships, because we could not defend them if they were Kuwaiti tankers, but we could defend them if they were American flag tankers. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, we went into Operation Desert Shield, not to liberate Kuwait, but to protect Saudi Arabia and Saudi oil fields, but that turned into Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait. And then there were massive US military deployments into the Middle East and Afghanistan following the attacks on September 11th in 2001. So with all of this activity over the past 3 or 4 decades, why are the Arabs worried that we don't want to defend them anymore? It's a lot of steps over the course of the past 4 presidencies that have given this opinion. Let me go through some of them, the more important ones now. Going back to President George W. Bush, in 2008, it was President Bush who decided that the United States would withdraw its forces, combat forces, from Iraq at the end of 2011. And that was signed in October of 2008. It was something that he wanted to do, frankly, as a favor to Barack Obama, should Barack Obama win the election, to not make him pay the political price of making that decision. Barack Obama, in 2011, provided some soft support to the Arab Spring, where there were uprisings against dictatorial regimes in the Arab world. And many people saw, particularly in the lack of support for the dictator of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, from the Obama administration, that America had abandoned a close ally of the United States for a long time. And then for the Obama administration, the quintessential concern was the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in 2015. So when Donald Trump came in as president, he reestablished a lot of personal relationships in the Middle East, but his actions didn't match his rhetoric. For example, when the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps placed limpet mines on oil tankers off the coast of Fujairah in the Arabian Sea, the United States didn't take any action. When the Iranians shot down a US unmanned drone over the Persian Gulf, the US didn't take any action. When Iranian attacks on a center of Saudi oil production and oil processing in 2019 took place, and suddenly 4,000 barrels of oil a day were off the market, the United States didn't take any action, even much rhetorical action, and certainly no military action. So when Joe Biden became president, he already had a bad view and bad rhetoric about Trump policies, and he tied a lot of the mistakes that he saw that were being made by Arab countries to President Trump and highlighted them. For example, he, throughout his campaign, talked very disparagingly about Saudi Arabia for the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. His rhetoric and democratic rhetoric has focused on the need for better human rights and democracy in the Arab world. And although he's not really responsible for the deal that got people out of Afghanistan, the Biden administration did not handle the withdrawal from Afghanistan terribly well. All of this has been seen in the Middle East as 2 decades, 4 administrations, Republican and Democratic, of less and less emphasis on their security and on their prosperity. So if you look back over the past 4 presidencies, you might begin to see those trends that for people in the Middle East are actually quite obvious. And the third trend, which worries me, is that a lot of these decisions that were made by these presidents were driven by American politics. Now, when Ambassador Silverman and I joined the Foreign Service, 30 some years ago, there was an honored phrase that was politics stops at the water's edge. And that meant that most Republicans and most Democrats agreed on foreign policy, and even though they debated inside the country, when they left the country, they defended the current administration's foreign policy. Those days are gone. And in terms of the Middle East, now you have Republicans who focus on the stability of oil markets, counterterrorism operations, and corporate profits and American jobs from arms sales and other commercial activity with the Middle East. President Trump had particularly close relations with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he helped Benjamin Netanyahu's election campaign, and Netanyahu tried to help his campaign, which is, in many people's minds, inappropriate on both sides of that equation. And he also had very close relations with Saudi Arabian King Salman and his son, the Crown Prince and effective ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, including concluding almost literally last minute, but literally last 2 hours arms deals with the UAE and Saudi Arabia before he left the White House on January 20th, 2021. Democrats, by contrast, have focused on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, civilian casualties in the Saudi and Gulf War on Yemen, women's rights, particularly in Saudi Arabia, greater support on the left side of the Democratic Party for Palestinians, and a weakening of some of the traditional Democratic support for Israel, and a lot of concern about human rights and people being punished for speech in the Middle East. So, as I said in my introduction, when President Biden took over as president, he didn't do much about the Middle East. He focused on re-engaging with our traditional partners in NATO, in Europe, but also Japan, South Korea. He wanted to rebuild the relationships he felt that President Trump had injured. He took steps to work on how to deal with the rising China. He re-emphasized climate change, got back into the Paris Climate Accord. The only real Middle East issue that he dealt with directly and publicly was his desire to return to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE got very little public attention in the first year and a couple of months of the Biden administration. And some of the steps in policy that President Biden took in that first year, again, were seen as bad decisions or more evidence that the United States didn't support our traditional Arab friends and allies. He immediately put on hold for review the arms deals with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that President Trump had signed just before he left office. President Biden essentially refused to deal with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia is very important to the United States in a number of different areas. And on January 17th of this year, something that most Americans probably don't even know about, there was an Iranian-inspired attack on the airport in Abu Dhabi in the UAE in which 3 people were killed. Normally when this happens, senior officials from friendly countries call the country's leader, they call the defense minister and say, we're very sorry that that happened. What can we do to help? Nobody from Washington called Abu Dhabi. And it was seen as not only evidence that we didn't care about them, it was seen as an insult to not even check in with your close friends. This is especially odd from Joseph Biden, who made his reputation over 4 years in the Senate as one who did business based on personal relationships and the ability to talk to people with different views, work across the aisle. And that was what he said he was trying to do in the United States. But unfortunately, it took the crisis that was created with the Saudis and with the Emiratis from this omission of policy to kind of kick them into gear. And what I think happened right after that is they finally realized, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the spike in price of oil and the spike in price of a lot of grain, that they really needed to re-engage with the Middle East in a big way very, very quickly. So at some point in the spring, Biden and his top advisors said, we got to do something. And they did what, in my opinion, is probably the most dramatic, but also the most risky, politically risky, both internationally and domestically, thing that President Biden could do, make a personal trip to the Middle East and particularly go to Saudi Arabia to try to repair relations. So, what happened on this trip? And I'm going to go through the whole trip really quickly to give you a sense of the priorities, but also some of the things that the Biden people were trying to deal with as they planned the trip. He first flew to Israel, but the situation when they planned the trip was actually quite simple. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, unfortunately, the week before the visit, lost his majority in the Knesset, so they set new elections. Bennett was no longer the prime minister, and there was an interim prime minister. So Biden had to be very careful in Israel not to say or do anything that would strengthen the very strong conservatives, or particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, in elections that are going to be held on November 2nd. So he walked a tightrope also with his Democratic colleagues, because you now have both the centrist Democrats, who are very strong supporters of Israel traditionally, but a smaller but very vocal wing of Democrats on the left who are increasingly sympathetic to Palestinian views. So Biden had to kind of walk the tightrope between those two desires to continue to support Israel as a Democrat, but also not insult the people on the left of his party. Biden told the Israelis that he would never let Iran get a nuclear weapon, but didn't really explain what that means, and I'm not entirely sure that this was a promise with a lot underneath it in terms of planning. He decided not to reopen the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which is something he had talked about during the campaign and that a lot of people on the left of the Democratic Party wanted to see. And he made only a relatively small gift of money to the Palestinians, specifically for health care, and he went to Bethlehem to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, but only met with him for about 20 minutes. It was a cursory visit to say, yes, we know that the Palestinians are there, but not a lot of substance was done. It was a very difficult visit for him to balance politically, and the timing was part of it, but they felt if they were going to go to Saudi Arabia and talk to the Arabs, they needed to go to Israel first. So after he finished in Israel and the West Bank, they flew directly from Israel to Saudi Arabia. So the first thing is, this is the first time that an American president has ever flown directly from Israel to Saudi Arabia. So there was a little bit of support for Israel in that, and showed the flexibility that the Saudis had given to let them do that. There was the famous sort of fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman that you may have seen on the news, which was awkward, but nonetheless showed that Biden was willing to deal with the Crown Prince in a way that he had not done before. And the meetings after that were carefully choreographed to show that Biden and the delegation would deal with the Crown Prince as in a group with ministers and people responsible for policy, but not necessarily one-on-one. Biden quietly pressed the Saudis for more oil production, but also quietly pressed the Saudis to help manage the expectations of oil markets, and the press statements and actions of the Saudi government in particular are almost as important to oil market and oil prices as how much oil they produce. He met regional leaders, all the Arab leaders of the Gulf, and invited the new president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, to Washington by the end of the year. So it was a number of concrete steps, but it wasn't really what Americans expected. Because of the focus of both the administration and the US media before the trip, people expected the Saudis to produce an extra couple of million barrels of oil a day, for oil prices to go down, for gas prices to go down. This isn't what happened. But what did Biden get out of this trip? He walked a very careful tightrope in Israeli politics and in Democratic Party politics, and probably didn't make anything worse in a couple of very tense and difficult situations. He broke the ice with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and made it possible now for the United States to do a lot of different things with the Saudis, which we hadn't been doing in the first year of the Biden administration. He got a small increase of 100,000 barrels a day of oil, along with a lot of Saudi and OPEC producer messaging that helped calm the oil markets and brought the oil price down below $100 a barrel. He has accelerated military cooperation with our Arab partners in the Gulf. And he pressed them very, very hard, especially the Saudis and the Emiratis, to work out a way to end their war in Yemen that's produced hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. But most important in all of this, for Biden's trip, the medium was the message. The fact that he went, that he traveled, changed his schedule significantly to go to Saudi Arabia, to talk to the other leaders of the Gulf and our Arab partners, was an attempt to show that he really did care and that he was going to focus more on the Middle East in his foreign policy in the future. So what should we look for next? Several things I think you should watch as you're watching the news, as you're reading the newspaper. First of all, look at oil prices. Saudi Arabia has decided, along with Russia and a couple of other major producers, that they'd kind of like oil to stick around the $90 a barrel number. That covers their cost. It keeps oil prices higher in the West but stable. This is going to be difficult to do in face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that the United States and Europe has put on Russia and Russian energy. But there have been also a lot of other moves that are happening kind of behind the scenes. Release of millions of barrels of oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserves, and a lot of media messaging in particularly oil journals and in oil circles to calm the market so that everybody can understand that prices are not going to spike again, and that Saudi Arabia and most of the Arab countries and the United States government will do the best possible to keep the oil market stable and prices predictable, if not as low as people would like. Look at what is going to happen between the United States and our Arab allies on military cooperation. You may have seen in the past few weeks that the Iranian Navy has captured and then given back a number of unmanned U.S. sail drones. These unmanned sail drones are very sophisticated electronic surveillance devices that sail around right now the Persian Gulf. And the Iranians don't like the information that these are able to collect, but it provides the United States and our allies in the region invaluable information, frankly, that didn't exist before a couple of months ago when the Navy started deploying these. I think this will spark more cooperation on the defense side, not necessarily in terms of kinetic action, but more incentive for our Arab partners to work with us. I think you will see the United States continuing to lead something that the academics who work for me at my institute call mini-lateralism. You're going to see a lot of new academic terms coming out. This basically means coalitions of the willing or small groupings of countries formed generally for a specific purpose. The first one was something that was called the New Quad, which was U.S., Australia, Japan, and India as kind of an economic and political bloc to counter or block Chinese influence in Asia. You now have in the Middle East something called I2U2, which is Israel, India, the UAE, and the US, mostly focused on economic cooperation and how to take advantage of new economic relations between the UAE and Israel that were made possible by the Abraham Accords, which was a Trump administration accomplishment in the Middle East. And that's the other thing to watch. The Abraham Accords are actually very important. This is probably Trump's most significant foreign policy achievement in the Middle East. And it was the normalization of relations of 4 Arab countries with Israel: the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. This has the potential of changing the way that Arabs and Israelis see each other and deal with each other, and adds economic and social and cultural elements to the relationships that really haven't existed before. The fault of the relationship is that of the Abraham Accords is it doesn't really take into account Palestinians and Palestinian desires, and that's going to be a break on the complete acceptance of these relations with Israel on the part of some Arab countries, including the most important one, Saudi Arabia, that have not yet normalized with Israel. Watch what happens to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. My own personal opinion is that we've gotten so far down the road, and neither side, neither Washington nor Tehran, really wants a deal. But I don't think that either side will walk away from it, but I also would be very surprised if they signed it in the near term. I think you can see this kind of back and forth, exchanging papers, criticizing each other's sides, changes to the agreement going forward for a long time until the political conditions in the region make it advantageous for both the United States and for Iran to come back to this deal. And then finally, one of the things that I think will be really important, since Biden spent a lot of his prestige going to the region to show the region that he cared, he needs to make sure that this continues. It doesn't mean that he has to go out again to the region, but it does mean he has to make some phone calls. It means he has to send his cabinet members, Energy Secretary Granholm, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, CIA Director Bill Burns, and other senior officials to talk to our friends and allies in Israel and the Gulf, in Jordan, in Iraq, and Egypt, to make sure that whatever goodwill was gained during this trip doesn't sort of fritter away through continued or resumed inaction on the part of the Biden administration. So my take on America, Joe Biden, and the changing landscape of the Middle East is that despite some serious initial missteps and frankly not paying enough attention to the Middle East, the administration has changed and now knows what it needs to do. I just don't know how long they're going to be able to sustain this energy on the Middle East, given everything else that's going on in the world that they have to worry about. So with that, I will leave you with the introduction and we'll go to some discussion and question and answers.
Can you all hear me well enough? Thank you very much, Doug, for that excellent presentation and a lot to think of. And I'm glad he ended with a section on what you should all look for, because the idea is you may have learned some things from Doug tonight, but what's important is do you have the tools to do your own filtering of the news in the coming months and ask all the questions. So open the floor to questions. Please stand up when you ask a question. I will repeat it for purposes of the recording, and then you can give an answer. Okay. Please, questions. Don't be shy.
On the Iran deal, one has the impression that short-term Iran was going to be slowed down in their nuclear desires, but in 10 or 15 years, nothing would prevent them from getting the capability and also developing missiles, which were not part of it. So what's going to prevent them in 5 or 10 years from, we believe they desire to have those weapons and deliver mechanisms. How does Biden convince anybody the U.S. is going to step in? And a corollary to that is, one has the impression that Israel has the capability. If no one else helped them, they can't stand the thought of Iran with nuclear weapons and threats, so they will take it out. So there's a mini war on that. So what's going to happen? The U.S. going to prevent? What's going to happen there?
So the question is regarding this JCPOA possible agreement. Even if there is an agreement, there may well come a time when the Iranians are in fact capable of putting together a nuclear weapon and using it. And then what does the administration do then? How does it message? How does it deal with its neighbors of support? And if Israel takes action militarily in the wake of an imminent threat, let's say, or whatever, what would be the United States policy, and what would the United States do in that case?
Is this on, or do you do this? How much time do we have tonight? I've got a couple of hours with that answer. At the first part, the JCPOA stopped Iran's nuclear development and walked it back until Donald Trump got out of it. So it was working. What you said is true. There was a time period of between 10 and 15 years that things would be suspended. The hope was that during that 10 or 15 years, there would be more progress to walk back other parts, work on things like potential missiles, but also other pieces of Iran's ability to project strategic power in the region. So honestly, it was pulling out of the JCPOA that essentially released Iran from the responsibilities to abide by what they'd agreed to in 2015, and their program has expanded and developed exponentially faster in the past 2 years than it did before. So the question is, what do we do about it? I'm not sure that we can put the genie back in the bottle. This is definitely my personal opinion. But if I were Iran, I would not build a nuclear weapon, because I don't need a nuclear weapon to project my strategic power in the region. I use support for proxy forces, militias in the countries that don't agree with me. The Iranian version of America's forward defense doctrine is essentially make sure that the people who might be a threat to Iran are destabilized at home so they don't have a chance to attack Iran. And they see this as a defensive mechanism. So you have the ability now, Iran has developed drones, cruise missiles, and some medium-range ballistic missiles, none yet capable of carrying a nuclear warhead if they had one, but they're developing very quickly. So the real question is going to be, how does the world prioritize the threat from Iran? How does the United States work with Israel and our allies in the Gulf, something that the Obama administration didn't really do very much in 2013, 14, 15, before the agreement was signed, to try to make sure we are together, at least with the region, on what to do about Iran. I really don't know if we will ever be able to go back to the kind of pressure that was put on Iran before the JCPOA was negotiated, because we had all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including Russia and China, applying economic sanctions to Iran. Since that time, and since the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA, Russia and China have become real strategic partners of Iran. And China is significantly invested and is buying under the table a lot of Iranian oil, which we are still trying to sanction. As for Israel, Israel currently does not have the ability to take out the Iranian nuclear program. It has been too hardened. They can delay it using cyber attacks that they have often done, probably in conjunction or in cooperation with the United States. But I will note this week that there was an announcement of U.S. willingness to sell, I think it was 4 long-range air refueling aircraft to Israel, which could permit Israel the ability to fly aircraft from Israel to Iran, which they don't currently have. Something that had not been the case before. So as part of President Biden's promise to Israel that we would not let Iran get a nuclear weapon, this gives Israel more capability to go kinetically, to go using a military attack against the Iranian program. It's still going to be a very difficult thing to do because it's now dispersed and buried deep underground. And most crucially, the knowledge of Iran scientists has now been developed to a point that it wasn't 5 or 10 years ago, and that knowledge is not going to be lost now. So even if Israel does this, I think that it will retard the program. It might even convince the Iranians at some point that they need a nuclear weapon so that they can challenge Israel directly. So it could be a very dangerous situation. It could also spark an arms race in the Middle East. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia is going to want a nuclear weapon. They might buy one from Pakistan or buy one from North Korea because they don't have the expertise to do it now, but they've got the money to do an awful lot of stuff that they might not be able to develop themselves. So the region could become a lot more dangerous. Is the return to the JCPOA the fix to this? I don't know. It could be part of a fix. And those of us who worked on the issue sort of in the region before the JCPOA was negotiated had hoped that once the JCPOA was signed in 2015, we could continue the pressure on Iran to talk about negotiations on missiles. And there's a lot of experience with the Soviet Union and NATO on negotiating arms control on missiles, but also putting more pressure on Iran about support of opposition groups and opposition militaries inside other countries. Instead, the Trump administration took it back before square one, and we kind of started all over again. So I think we've lost a lot of that leverage. I honestly don't know what. I'm hoping that the Iranians are smart and strategic and decide not to build a bomb just to kind of have the pieces sitting in the basement.
I just say that often, as a rule of thumb, it's better to have the threat of the capability than the capability itself, because if you had the capability, there will be repercussions for you. And you know, if you look at the Iran problem, you can connect it to everything else that's going on. What lessons are taken away? What lessons do the Iranians take away from the kind of unity of community that we've had against Russia on Ukraine. I tend to think that the Chinese have taken a little lesson of this for their own intentions about Taiwan, to see a surprisingly united U.S. and Europe together. Certainly it was a surprise to Russia. Iran would love to have the United States on one side of the issue and Europeans on the other side, on their side, or at least a little softer on them. And they might lose that by actually developing the capability as opposed to keeping us somewhere in limbo in between. Next question. Yes, please.
You mentioned that there might be a real possibility to an end of the long war in Yemen. Would you elaborate on that, please?
I'm so sorry, Doug. So the question was if we could, Doug could elaborate on possibilities for a solution to the longstanding Yemen crisis.
Well, this is something I really hope for and something that my institute has been writing a lot about. For those of you who don't know much about the war in Yemen, I'll do a little recap. In 2015, Saudi Arabia and other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council essentially started attacking Yemen when a group of Shias loosely tied to Iran overthrew what they considered to be the legitimate government of Yemen, although it was beyond its expiration date, and took over the capital of Sana'a. This quickly escalated and caused, because the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, I think the Bahrainis were also flying missions, didn't have good precision munitions, did not have a lot of experience in bombing difficult targets. A lot of targets that should not have been hit were hit, and probably now tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the bombing, and a couple of 100,000 civilians have died in the course of being displaced from their homes, having no access to medical care, food, water. This has been going on now for almost 8 years. The Saudis sold this war in 2015 basically as a war against Iran. Unfortunately, it really wasn't. This was a war against a Shia group in Yemen that wanted to take control of the country, but it provided Iran an opportunity and some potential allies, which Iran quickly took advantage of by supplying training and weapons to the Houthi rebels, they're called, this tribal group in Yemen. So even though in 2015 the ties between the Houthis and Iran were relatively weak, now they're quite strong. And the attack that I mentioned in Abu Dhabi in January of this year that I said was the responsibility of the Iranians, there were Iranian drones and Iranian cruise missiles launched by the Houthis from Yemeni territory against Abu Dhabi. It has become clear because of the civilian casualties and now the balance of the war between the more than two sides in the conflict that no one is poised to win. The United Nations and the very good UN Special Representative for Yemen, a guy named Tim Lenderking, a good friend of ours, has done amazing work to keep a ceasefire going now for 4 months, and they're trying to extend it beyond this, to come up with a plan that will bring the Houthis into government in an organized way. And the problem has been the Houthis have not been willing to compromise on their demands to end the hostilities and participate in a broader government. So what you have now for the first time, probably since 2015, is the willingness of the Saudi Arabian government to negotiate seriously with the Houthis, mostly to find a face-saving way out of the war, but to end the war, because it uses a lot of Saudi resources, and they've gotten a very bad reputation for the things that they have done. The Emiratis essentially withdrew their forces from Yemen 2.5 years ago because they began to see the political cost of continuing the war, but they're still supporting forces in Yemen that are fighting against the Houthis. Part of the discussions that the Saudis and the Iranians have been carrying out, actually in Baghdad in Iraq over the past 6 months, have been about how can everybody stop the humanitarian tragedy and the fighting in Yemen and save face and extract themselves well. And this is one of the reasons, as I talk about multipolarity and the way that countries are now beginning to act, they aren't necessarily looking to the United States or the United Nations to provide them the solutions. What they want is they're now beginning to engage directly with people behind the Houthis to see whether they can work out a deal with the Iranians, even though the Saudis and Iranians don't like each other. because neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia really wants to continue this war. So the political background of the war has changed a bit. There is international pressure now on the Saudis and on the Iranians. The last remaining piece is to get the Iranian clients, these Houthis, to agree to what most everybody can agree is an equitable power sharing agreement in Yemen, but most importantly, to continue the ceasefire that has been in place for 4 months. And that's the first goal, but this is as optimistic as we have been about Yemen in 8 years.
So can I just ask, do we think that the Iranians have evolved in their messaging? Since there is a ceasefire going on, what do we think the Iranians are saying to the Houthis? Go along with this, don't go along with it? Do we know anything about this?
We don't really know what the Iranians are saying to the Houthis, but it is clear that the Iranians have pressed the Houthis not to conduct such lethal attacks against Saudi forces or Yemeni government forces. It has been, while at the same time they continue to provide training and weapons to the Houthis. So it's sort of mixed messages from Iran to the Houthis. I think Iran would like to extricate itself from the war, as would the Saudis, but they're only going to do it on terms that they can agree with, and that's going to be the hard part. I also don't know at the end of the day if the Iranians ask the Houthis to cease hostilities, agree to a power sharing agreement for a new Yemeni government, whether the Houthis will agree only because the Iranians ask, because they are not a client group of the Iranians. They've been supported by the Iranians, but they entered these hostilities willingly for their own ends, which they have not yet achieved.
Next question. Yes, please.
Just a question of 5, 10, 15 years ago, I used to hear about Egypt in the same breath as Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. What is going on with Egypt? No one ever talks about Egypt anymore.
So the question, and it's one I have, I have over the years have asked myself periodically. I think we can answer it too, but what's happened with Egypt? You used to hear about Egypt as a great Arab power, at least a great Middle Eastern power, at least on the order of a Saudi Arabia, if not more, at one time, and you just don't hear about it. And why is that? And what's the situation with Egypt's role in the larger Middle East?
Okay, well, Egypt still plays a very big role in the Middle East, but we have to go back about 10 or 12 years to see sort of the decline of Egypt as a regional power, and frankly, a restructuring of power among Arab capitals and countries in the Middle East. But the big, simplify this significantly, the big hit to Egypt was the Arab Spring starting in 2011. You may remember the news photos of the tens of thousands of people gathered in Tahrir Square in the center of Cairo, which essentially led to the departure of Hosni Mubarak. It led to the election of an Islamist government, which then was overthrown by the military and replaced by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is now the president and still basically the dictator of Egypt. Sisi has taken, he came to power essentially opposing an Islamist-run government in Egypt. But what he has ended up doing is persecuting both the right, the Islamist conservatives, and the left, liberal intellectual secularists. And Egypt's economy, in the midst of all this, hasn't collapsed, but it has needed an awful lot of life support. And it is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and maybe Qatar that have put a lot of money into development projects, but also cash into the central bank of Egypt to keep the currency going and keep their current account balance good. More broadly, you have seen a complete shift in the power structure of the Middle East in the past 20 years. So the big capitals of the Arab world going back 1,000 years were Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus. And what has happened, Saddam Hussein basically ruined Baghdad, and then in 2003 we destroyed whatever he hadn't ruined by invading and taking out his government. Syria under Hafez al-Assad had gotten isolated from the world, and under Bashar al-Assad, his son, is further back from the world and too closely tied now with Iran and bad people in the world to have a lot of influence. And Cairo has had not only a series of repressive governments, both secular and religious, but very little economic development and a hugely growing population, so that they are overwhelmed by their own problems. And maybe that's the easiest answer.
Yeah, I think there's a lesson here. The more you have, the more domestic problems you have, the more you turn inward, and the less you can project power outward.
And the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris have taken their place because they have money, they are newly empowered, they feel agency, and as I said, they want to do things that they see are in their own interest, and now they don't have to talk to Cairo or Baghdad or Damascus before they do it.
So where was President Sisi most recently? In Doha, in Qatar.
In Doha, in Qatar.
In Qatar. Qatar used to be considered the main backer of Sisi's opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Emirates put up the first money to Egypt, but just to show you that things can change in the Middle East, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis made up with Qatar, ended that split, and Qatar is now supporting Egypt financially as well.
Yeah.
Maybe one more, or I don't know. Please.
It's hard for me to stand.
No.
Oh, please.
Are we just giving MBS a pass on Khashoggi?
So the question's very simple, but probably on a lot of minds, and certainly in the media. Has the United States given Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, a pass on the killing of Jamal Khashoggi?
I'm going to rephrase the question for you, and it's more complicated than that. The answer is yes, kind of, but what country is most influential in the price of oil that you pay, the price that you pay for gas at the pump? Saudi Arabia. What country is most influential in the United States countering Iranian expansion in the region? Saudi Arabia. What country is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in new infrastructure and signing billions and billions of contracts with American companies? Saudi Arabia. What country in the past 2 years has let women drive, let women not have to get the permission of their husbands, their sons, or their brothers to travel or go to the doctor, go overseas, go to university? Saudi Arabia. What country just held in the spring a rave outside of Riyadh to which 100,000 people, mixed men and women, attended and danced at a music festival? Saudi Arabia. The question is, in terms of US interests, where do we put the probably deliberate killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the pantheon of US interests? It's an important point, and there are other points that we also have to look at. It's not just Jamal Khashoggi. There is still persecution of people who make anti-government statements on Twitter and on social media. A poor woman activist was just sentenced to 34 years in prison for things that she tweeted, which would be seen as completely innocuous here in the United States. I don't know why that was such a bad decision, but it's one of those things that has happened. When I was last in Saudi Arabia, literally the week before the world shut down before COVID, so it's been 2.5 years. But I went around only to Riyadh, but talked to a lot of people, young and old. And I have never seen Saudi Arabia as optimistic, as energized, and as looking to the future, not the past, as I did 2.5 years ago. And I think that's only accelerated since then. So I think that you can make the argument that the killing of one journalist, even if deliberate, weighed against all of these other issues is something we have to address, but it should not be the determining factor in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's where I come from. I think that's where President Biden comes from. I know that is not where some people on the left of the Democratic Party come from, and I know that is not where most Republicans come from. But I think that, in my view, what is best for the interest of the United States, and right now a close relationship with Saudi Arabia is important for a lot of reasons, argues for not forbearance or forgiveness, but dealing with the country and dealing with this issue and the human rights issues and the persecution issues as part of this larger package to try to make it turn out as good as we possibly can. So.
Thank you. So thank you to our ambassador tag team. First, Doug Silliman, who made the presentation. Secondly, one of our own board members, Larry Silverman, who moved here not quite 2 years ago, but you will see him often. He's on 1 year ago. Okay. As my wife would say, ish, you know. But anyway, thank you very much for a terrific presentation, Doug, and Larry for helping out on the Q&A program. What I'd like to do as we wrap up first is to thank the young ladies from Savannah State who came up and gave us an insight on your time in Costa Rica as well as South Korea. Thank you, well done. And thank you also to the students from Savannah Country Day who added some vitality to this presentation this evening. Yeah, high five, I appreciate it very much. And last, I would say, before you go home, that our next program is going to be on October 13th. It'll be right here. And the program will be The Importance of Savannah in World Trade, one American company's perspective working for an international company, one American's perspective working for an international company in the coastal empire. I think that's really something. I think we've heard about the port, we've toured the port and so forth, but one significant company that really contributes to the economy and the welfare and the fabric of our living here is going to talk about its perspective, why it chose to come to Savannah, and what its outlook is for continuing to contribute to the Savannah. So thank you all for coming very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate it. Be careful going home.